Welcome to a primer on productive narratives, driving solutions through effective framing, brought to you by the American Public Human Services Association. The primer aims to introduce the science behind how narratives form and why it matters to our collective work. We'll share some of the tools we have developed at APHSA to support application of the research to our daily work. We'll share some specific examples and introduce additional resources that can help anyone wanting to strengthen framing and narrative muscles. So let's start by taking a look at the cognitive science behind how narratives form. How is it that we make meaning of incoming communications? To understand why framing is so core to our collective work, we have to start by peering inside our thinking apparatus, our brains. To be more effective framers and influencers, we first need to know what is it that we are speaking into, and how does that information get heard? We have to understand what is actually in our brain in order to open communication lines to more productive ways of thinking. So when we communicate an idea to someone, we want to believe that we are speaking into a blank slate with someone who is not only listening to us, but fully receiving what we have to say. The reality, however, is that we are speaking into a sorting device, something that's been taking information in from the time we were kids and constantly finding ways to process it. Over the course of our lives, we apply cultural or simplifying models that make it easier for us to think about incoming information. So how much do we see of what's in there? When we communicate an idea, we actually see very little of what's in the mind of the receiver. When we see the opinions expressed in response to what we have said, and we may, if we're lucky, get some nonverbal cues as well, but we don't see any of the organizing frames that shape the opinion expressed. Frames are the organizing principles that we use to provide meaningful structure to the world around us. They're social, shared, and persistent over time, and we are constantly mapping incoming information to them. We are always selectively responding to things we hear, for example, in a news story, by queuing up the networks of associations we have stored to help us make meaning of our world. We are constantly mapping new information in a way that appears to fit our existing mindset. In other words, our mind has a whole set of pre-existing patterns of thinking. Through narrative work and cognitive science, we are working to understand the dominant frames Americans use to reason about issues we care about, and then identify what frame elements might allow us to shift old beliefs and provide thinking tools or ways that people can think more productively about issues, particularly those that involve understanding systems and structures. So, what is it we all encounter? When we hear new information, it forms a neural network in our brain, sort of like the groove in an LP. The more often something is repeated, the deeper the groove or the organizing frame. Information feels truer the second time you hear it, and more each subsequent time. Newly received messages on the same topic tend to slide into the pre-existing deeper grooves. One of the first lessons in effective framing is to know what's already in there, the grooves where your communication may land. In our culture, certain narratives are repeated over and over and become quote unquote shared. You can spot them in common expressions and stories that almost everybody knows, and how those expressions translate into widely ingrained values and beliefs. These become cognitive shortcuts for how we process new incoming information. Take, for example, the story of the little engine that could, a story of you can do whatever you put your mind to. The idea of resilience and hard work gets reinforced not only from the many times we heard the story of the little engine that could as a kid, but it becomes a placeholder for any story we hear of someone overcoming the odds or advancing through hard work and grit. This is particularly strong shared narrative in the United States and shows up in other sayings like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and the theme of rugged individualism. So on the screen here, you see grooves like government dependency and ineffectiveness, and us versus them thinking that we do not want to fall into when communicating our work. They are unproductive mental modes. Understanding that these are default mindsets is key to being able to disrupt them and shift to more productive ways of thinking. In human services, too often we reinforce these by talking about vulnerable populations, repairing the social safety net, showing people climbing a ladder out of poverty, often triggering the us versus them thinking. We also tend to think we can make a compelling example from a program participant who has achieved self-sufficiency, but too often this squarely lands in our nation's rugged individualism or self-making defaults. We also try too often to reinforce narratives by rebutting the criticisms aimed at human service programs. We try to dispel the myths, in other words, and that ends up simply reinforcing the dominantly held frames of government is incompetent and individuals are responsible for their own behavior. It's also important to understand what we're up against. Complex, long-standing societal issues challenge our ability to take information in. Researchers have found that human beings have a limited capacity to think about risks or concerns. This is something that social scientists have dubbed as a finite pool of worry. Similarly, we are prone to fatalistic thinking. If we believe a challenge is too big, complex, entrenched to address or solve, we will, like Chicken Little, be obsessed with the skies falling that we won't be able to focus on the root of the problem, or we're so filled with worry that we choose to ignore the issue altogether, often tuning out what is being said. And so how do frames get amplified? So much of our narratives today are shaped by online communications and social media and the multiple places we get our news beyond traditional press, which can deepen these grooves even more. We experience echo chambers through Facebook and other online platforms. People who we know, who are often quite a bit like us, read our posts and we read theirs. This makes us believe lots of people agree with us. Whatever we like or share, Facebook shows us more of. This narrows and amplifies the echo chamber effect. We need only take one look at the apps on our smartphones around us to see the way social media platforms attempt to maximize engagement by triggering a race to the bottom of the brainstem. And unfortunately, fear, anger win over videos of cute puppies nearly all the time. So at APHSA, narratives have become core to our ability to advance our work on behalf of our members and alongside our partners. At APHSA, for several years now, we have been using framing science and applying research coming out of Frameworks Institute. We're very grateful for their research to drive our solutions. Like many organizations, we began by revising our own mission and vision statements to ground the work in what we aspire to achieve. And we took a look at our theory of action, ensuring that we are effectively framing from the start is core to our theory of action. And we use framing science and research to build common ground and drive our solutions. These are the shared values that you see on the screen that our work is founded on. Human potential, the idea that we all have potential and should have the opportunity to make the most of it. Pragmatism, that there are practical, workable steps we can take. Prevention, the idea that it's important to get ahead of issues before they occur. And fairness across places. The idea that living to our potential should not be determined by the zip code where we grow up, go to school, work, raise our kids, or retire. And producing productive narratives is one of the 6 key areas we are trying to impact with and through our members. You can see our focus on productive narratives in all we do. For example, our current policy agenda, Cornerstone, starts with a detailed explanation of why human services matter. You can check out our Cornerstone briefs on our website, and just to get a short example of what it looks like when we think about first defining why human services matter, we say, human services are the essential bricks and mortar that undergird what allows all of us an equitable opportunity to live our fullest lives. Human services help shape and support us at key points in our lives, opening opportunities for lifelong success. Human services provide foundational supports to families facing adversity and ensure resilience at familial and community levels that help us weather life's inevitable ups and downs. And another example here on the right side of your screen, our local county members co-developed an infographic that has become a shared frame to showcase the innovative and proven practices occurring across the country, shining a spotlight on what is already possible, spurring further policy changes, and supporting the spread and scale of effective practices. So we've been building our capacity to effectively frame and produce more productive narratives. We know that it takes practice, lots of practice, and we continue to learn. We've developed approaches and tools that have helped us apply the research and model a more effective narrative for the field, and we want to share those with you. It is helpful to use this formula. Start with a tested value that primes the listener, followed by a tested metaphor that show, not tell, why it works, illustrate, make it come alive in the real world, and then bring a practical solution that's within reach. And remember that the sequence, tested value, tested metaphor, illustration, and policy solution matters. Let's take a deeper look. The first step is to start with a shared value that helps us see why we should care about this. What difference does it make? What's at stake? This helps prime the reader to what we have to say next. Again, the values we aim to trigger include the tested values of human potential, pragmatism, fairness across places, and prevention. Step 2. Starting with a value that is widely shared, something most Americans believe in, that the reader, listener can nod their head to. Metaphors help prime people to see how something works by comparing it with something they do understand. An example of a metaphor that works well for our work. In our work, the construction metaphor works well. The explanatory metaphor of construction tested very well in frameworks focus groups. It helps people see the many dimensions of well-being. It's not just about financial self-sufficiency or physical health, and it helps people see the constructing well-being as a team project involving the families and professionals as equal partners. It's not just because the kid has bad parents. It's not just about the choices an individual makes. It's effective at conveying what gets in the way, shaky foundations, poor missing materials, unexpected storms. And just remember too, not to overdo it. A light touch that primes the idea of something we all know how it works is sufficient. So step 3, now that you've shown an issue, how an issue works, it's time to illustrate the issue as it shows up in the real world. A few steps to, once we have primed the reader with a value and explanatory metaphor, we want to illustrate how it shows up in the real world. We can do this through multiple stories that illustrate the full landscape and through use of data that describes the problem and solution more fully. There's a few steps to keep in mind. Describe the bigger contextual picture in which we all live, learn, work, and play to show the intersection of people and systems. When we share a single example, we risk triggering the default thinking that whether or not someone succeeds is based on their effort alone. In human services, stories told across the life cycle can be particularly effective and avoid the tendency of people to overemphasize personal characteristics over situational factors in judging others' behavior. And remember too, where data fits in the formula, don't start with it. Make sure you share data in the context that people can relate to. For example, compare it to like things. And finally, that takes us to step 4, offering a policy solution that feels practical, achievable, and represents a wise investment. Your listeners should now be primed to hear your policy solution. You can use descriptors that convey that the solutions are within reach and offer practical steps we can take. Even if we don't yet have the full solution, we can offer practical common sense ways to tap the ingenuity of people and communities to move us closer to the solutions. So what does a well-framed statement look like? Here's an example of the formula applied to describing why human service organizations matter and helping people understand what they do. In yellow, you see the focusing on the aspirational and drawing on a shared value. In blue, you see the metaphor of using comparison phrases like just like a house. You see in the purplish color how to further illustrate it. Again, building on that metaphor, weathering storms, a vibrant community that has neighborhoods and places. Just even the soft word of using the word build is pretty compelling. And using phrases that are inclusive, that help us avoid the us versus them model. So we're everyone, help us, we share. Starting with these in particular can be particularly important. So these are on the screen now as I'm going to walk through each one, are words and phrases we have found helpful to use. So overcoming the us versus them and the fatalism, too big to fix mental models. These are words and phrases that can be particularly helpful. People first descriptions are important ways of making sure that we aren't triggering default thinking. Constructing well-being, there are so many ways to build on this metaphor in describing the work in human services as key building blocks, as weathering life's storms, as equipping everyone with the equipment to get the job done, just as a few examples. And solution-oriented and pragmatic words are very helpful in pointing to the policy solutions. So advancing what works, showing that something's within our reach, moving and working toward our important signals to what, where we are headed, including also words like right now and currently that signal what is already being done. Other ways to encourage phrases to encourage is to look at metaphors that can work alongside construction, especially when considering design of a well-planned, inclusive community. So when you're illustrating the larger context and pointing towards solutions, it can help to draw on these, like laying down the tracks or pulling on the power grid and connecting people to community services and supports, just like they might plug into the power grid, and which requires that they have access to it. Or thinking about GPS navigation and the powerful tool, especially alongside data, to chart our routes from where we are as a community and where we want to be. Of course, there are words and descriptors we want to avoid as well. These are some that we try to avoid at APHSA whenever possible. It's worth noting also, as you think about these, triggering those that trigger us versus them, those that trigger government dependency, and those that trigger the fatalistic thinking, that in a time like now, when we are in a crisis or have been in a extended emergency situation, that often some of these problematic words show up more frequently, and we need to actively look for ways to reframe them. So some rules of thumb to keep at the forefront. When making specific word choices, these are some of the things we encourage you to think through. Focus your opening remarks in ways that are aspirational and appeal to all audiences. Do so by using words or phrases that illustrate our interconnectedness to each other, like all of us, us. Avoid words that are crisis-oriented, overly negative, or otherwise invoke fatalistic thinking that a problem is too big to solve. Tie descriptions of issues and solutions to fixing systems, not people or behaviors. Think about painting a landscape, not a portrait. For solutions to fixing systems to make sense, the listener reader must first understand that the issue involves a system and know that the system works to produce results we don't want. This is why we need a metaphor. And when mentioning specific groups, use people-first descriptions, families with low income, people experiencing homelessness, not homeless people. And don't reinvent the wheel. Draw from APHSA publications and tools. So as we come to a close here, we'll share a few more slides that you can take a closer look at the end of the audio here and video. These are examples of concepts in human services that benefit from further illustration, and we've given you some ways to start thinking about that. So, for example, we often talk about needing to get at root causes. Use this to illustrate what gets in the way of well-being. Before you build a house, it makes sense to determine what's underneath. Deep roots, too much water in the soil that could destabilize the foundation, and address them. If they occur after you've built the house, you go in and correct them to stabilize the structure. The idea, of course, of explaining why getting at root cause is so important to the foundation. So we also wanted to share some of our thinking through complex concepts and how to do that through a framing lens. So you might ask yourself, for example, this idea of how communities and people have been structurally disempowered, a complex system. How do you go about thinking about it? You ask yourself first, is it a policy issue for which we have proposed solutions? And I think the answer is yes, we know some things that work. And what values might work to open our thinking? So here we might think about fairness across places, or pragmatism, our belief in practical ways of doing the work. And then we might apply a metaphor here of construction or tracks or a power grid to show that to claim and use power, for example, using the construction metaphor, that things are built, they're constructed, and that's how we tap our human potential. The tracks for involvement, having access so your voice is heard. And we know tracks to economic mobility don't run close to too many communities. So this helps people see how to lay new tracks to have stronger empowerment of communities. And the power grid, through which people can share power, advocate, and be heard. We know it's frayed and not well maintained in some areas, so people can't use power if they don't have access to the grid. This is another way of potentially explaining this complex issue of structural disempowerment of communities through a framing lens. Similarly, we show one here on systemic and structural racism, institutional racism, systemic inequities and disparities. Again, are there policy issues for which we have proposed solutions? Yes. What values might work to open thinking? Fairness across places and pragmatism again. And then when we pair it with a railroad tracks metaphor, you can see it here. Again, the idea of laying new tracks in order to connect generations of families, especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous Americans, to opportunities that increase intergenerational mobility and rates of upward mobility. So we are very thankful for a number of partners and places across the country who have been leading with great examples of narrative work. And so we share just a few on the screen here that you may want to check out further. There are many more than this, and we'll be adding more to our website. And we're thankful for researchers who helped and give us the tools to actually be able to apply framing to our work, and our many partners who, like us, have been working to understand narratives further and continue to look for research that will help us be as effective as possible and inclusive as possible in the way that we think about creating productive frames for our collective work. You can get more details on our webpage, which we will continuously update on our Productive Narratives landing page. And we encourage you also to check out many of the additional resources that are available there. Thank you for listening.